The word she used was creepy, not misguided, not loud, not even weird. Creepy. It's a word that lands with a certain thud. A wet, nasty little dart of a word that implies not just oddness, but a hint of malicious intent. It's a word you use for spiders in the bathtub, or clowns standing motionless in a field at dusk. It is not, in any sane universe, a word you should use to describe a man looking at a globular cluster 25,000 light-years away. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before the accusation, before the war, there was just peace and Bertha. Bertha is my telescope. A sky watcher 12 inches Dobsonian for those in the know. For those who aren't, imagine a navy blue cannon the size of a 4th grader, mounted on a lazy Susan made of particle board. She's not elegant. She's a beast of pure function, a light bucket designed to do one thing and one thing only: gobble up photons from the distant past and funnel them directly into my unworthy eyeball. I saved for 2 years to buy her, subsisting on a diet that consisted primarily of ramen and profound regret. She was worth every sad, sodium-rich mouthful. My townhouse, one of a dozen aggressively beige boxes on North Maple Street, had one saving grace: a flat, accessible roof. Every clear night, I'd perform the ritual. First, lugging Bertha's 50-pound base up the attic ladder, my knuckles scraping against the drywall. Then, the even more awkward 75-pound optical tube, a delicate dance of leverage and muttered curses. But once she was assembled under the vast, ink-black ceiling of the sky, the frustration would melt away, replaced by a quiet, electric hum of anticipation. Tonight was a Jupiter night. The air was crisp and still, the usual suburban light pollution tamed by a merciful lack of humidity. I calibrated my finder scope, nudged Bertha into position, and leaned into the eyepiece. And there it was, a perfect, pale orb, striped with bands of ochre and cream, flanked by 4 tiny, perfect pinpricks of light, the Galilean moons, Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto, dancing the same orbital waltz they had been dancing for billions of years. It was a sight that never failed to recalibrate my soul, to shrink my earthly problems down to their proper, insignificant size. My fight with the Wi-Fi router, my looming work deadline, my existential dread about the price of avocados, it all seemed rather silly when you were staring at a gas giant that could swallow Earth 1,000 times over. This was my sanctuary. A silent conversation with the cosmos. Up here, I was anonymous. A tiny consciousness perched on a spinning rock, granted a brief glimpse into the grand, silent machinery of it all. Of course, even sanctuaries have neighbors. For the past month, I'd been aware of a new presence across the street. Carol Peterson. I didn't know her name yet. At the time, she was just the Sentinel, a woman in her late 40s with a haircut you could set your watch to, and an unnerving habit of standing on her porch, staring. Not at anything in particular, just staring. Projecting an aura of managerial oversight onto the entire neighborhood. I'd seen her measuring the distance between her tulips with a ruler. I'd seen her leave a laminated note on a neighbor's car because its tire was touching the white line of their driveway. She was a self-appointed warden of suburban mediocrity, and her gaze had occasionally drifted up to my rooftop activities with a pinched, analytical expression. I paid it no mind. I was looking at things millions of miles away. She was, I assumed, worried about crabgrass. Our orbits were never meant to intersect. I was wrong. On this perfect, peaceful Jupiter night, our orbits were about to collide in a way that would bend the very fabric of North Maple Street. I had just swapped eyepieces, moving from a wide view of Jupiter to a higher magnification, trying to see if I could make out the great red spot. The focus knob was millimeters from perfect, the image swimming into crystalline clarity, when a voice ripped through the silence like a chainsaw through a library. "Excuse me!" It was shrill, loud, and laced with the kind of indignant fury that could curdle milk from 50 paces. I flinched, jerking my head back from the eyepiece and blinking at the sudden glare of a porch light from across the street. There she was, the Sentinel, Carol Peterson, standing on her perfectly manicured lawn, wrapped in a pink chenille robe, her arms crossed so tightly it looked like she was trying to administer her own Heimlich maneuver. "Hello?" she bellowed, as if I hadn't clearly reacted to her first volley. I sighed, the celestial peace of the moment shattering into a million pieces. "Evening," I called back, trying to keep my tone neutral, neighborly. It was a wasted effort. "I know you can hear me up there on your perch." My perch, I thought. What am I, a gargoyle? "Yes, I can hear you," I said. "Is everything all right?" "No, everything is not all right," she shot back, taking a few menacing steps onto the sidewalk. "I want to know exactly what you think you're doing up there with that thing." She pointed a rigid, accusatory finger at Bertha. "My beautiful, gentle, scientifically precise Bertha." I felt a surge of protective indignation. "This thing is a telescope," I explained, my voice tight with forced patience. "I'm looking at the planets." She let out a short, barking laugh that was utterly devoid of humor. "Oh, the planets. Is that what you call it? Don't play dumb with me, Sonny. I know exactly what you're doing." I genuinely didn't. "Ma'am, I assure you, I am just enjoying a little amateur astronomy. Jupiter is in a great position tonight, if you'd care to—" "Don't you patronize me," she snapped. "I see you up here every night with that high-powered surveillance device, pointing it all over the neighborhood." This was so far from reality that my brain took a moment to reboot. "Surveillance device? Ma'am, this is a Dobsonian reflector. It's designed for looking at objects that are, and I can't stress this enough, extremely far away. The optics are completely unsuited for terrestrial viewing. You'd get a better view of your neighbor's cat using a pair of binoculars from Walmart." "Lies!" she screeched, now fully in the center of the street, bathed in the orange glow of a streetlight. "I saw you. You had it pointed right at my house, right at my Tiffany's bedroom window." Okay, now we were entering a new level of absurdity. I looked at her house. Tiffany's bedroom, I presumed, was the one with the glowing unicorn nightlight. I also knew for a fact it was on the side of her house, a side I couldn't even see from my roof without performing advanced chiropractic maneuvers. "First of all," I said, my politeness finally cracking, "I physically cannot see your daughter's window from this angle. Second, even if I could, this telescope would show me an upside-down, blurry image of a single curtain fiber. It's a telescope, not a spy camera from a James Bond movie. It's physics." "Oh, so now you're a physicist?" she sneered. "You know what I think? I think it's creepy. That's the word for it. A grown man, hiding on his roof in the dark, pointing a giant periscope into people's homes. It's creepy and it's disgusting." There it was. The word, creepy, dropped like a little conversational atom bomb. My blood started to boil. All the quiet joy, the cosmic wonder was replaced by a hot, furious wave of injustice. I had spent thousands of dollars and countless hours on a hobby that was the literal opposite of what she was describing. It was about looking away from humanity, not spying on it. "Ma'am," I said, my voice dangerously calm, "my hobby is not creepy. Your baseless accusations, however, are bordering on harassment." This, it turned out, was exactly the wrong thing to say. "Harassment? Harassment? I'll show you harassment. This is a family neighborhood. We have rules. There are HOA covenants about this kind of thing. Unauthorized structures, nuisances. I'm going to have you and your peeping Tom machine removed. I'm calling the police. I'm reporting you." Her voice was rising with each threat, echoing down the silent, sleeping street. A few lights in other houses flicked on. My humiliation was now becoming a public spectacle. She stood there, a sentinel of suburban paranoia, hands on her hips, her pink robe flapping gently in the breeze. She had made her proclamation. "You do that," I said, my voice flat and cold. "You have a good night, ma'am." I didn't wait for a response. I turned my back on her, disassembled Bertha with furious, jerky movements, and practically threw the pieces down the attic ladder. I slammed the hatch shut, my heart hammering in my chest, her final shriek of, "This isn't over!" ringing in my ears. Down in my quiet living room, bathed in the pale glow of my laptop, I paced like a caged animal. The injustice of it was a living thing, a coiled snake in my gut. Creepy. She'd called my passion my escape. Creepy. And she'd threatened to take it away. Well, I thought, my rage beginning to cool and harden into something else, something sharper and more dangerous. If she wanted to make my private hobby a public issue, then by God, I'd make it the most public issue this neighborhood had ever seen. My hands were shaking, not with fear, but with pure, unadulterated rage. I snatched my phone off the counter and speed-dialed the one person who would appreciate the profound, weapons-grade absurdity of the last 10 minutes. Dave picked up on the second ring. "Dude, it's 11 p.m. If this is another existential crisis about whether a hot dog is a sandwich, I'm hanging up." "She called it a periscope," I said, my voice a low growl. "Who? What?" "The new neighbor, the sentinel, Carol. I think her name is Carol. She came out into the street and screamed at me. Screamed. Said I was a peeper. Said my telescope was a surveillance device I was using to spy on her daughter." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, followed by a sound that started as a choked cough and rapidly escalated into a full-blown cackle of hyena-like laughter. "No!" Dave howled. "You're kidding me, seriously?" "I have never been more serious in my entire life, Dave," I said, pacing a trench into my living room rug. "She threatened to call the cops. She threatened to report me to the HOA for running a peeping Tom machine. Her words, she called me creepy." "Oh, that is beautiful," he wheezed, gasping for air. "That is pure, uncut, suburban insanity. What did you say?" "I told her it was physics. I tried to be reasonable. It was like trying to explain calculus to a rock. A very loud, very stupid rock wrapped in a pink robe." I collapsed onto my sofa, the anger still bubbling. It was the unfairness of it, the sheer willful ignorance. My hobby was my quiet place, the one corner of my life that was free from drama and conflict. And she had just marched in and stomped all over it with her ugly, paranoid assumptions. "So what are you gonna do?" Dave asked, his laughter finally subsiding. "Just lie low for a while until she moves on to harassing someone about the height of their grass?" I stared at the ceiling. The anger was starting to curdle, to transform. It was solidifying into an idea. A terrible, wonderful, exquisitely petty idea. Malicious compliance. The art of following an order or complaint to such an extreme, literal degree that it exposes the foolishness of the original request. She wanted my hobby to be a public spectacle? Fine. "No," I said slowly, a dangerous smile spreading across my face. "No, I'm not going to lie low. I'm going to lean in." "Lean in how?" Dave asked, a note of intrigued caution in his voice. He knew this tone. This was my, I'm about to spend a disproportionate amount of time and money on a point of principle tone. She thinks what I'm doing is secretive and creepy, right? Because I'm on my roof alone in the dark. The problem isn't the telescope. The problem is the context. So, I'm going to change the context. Okay. I'm going to make it the most open, public, and transparent hobby in the history of North Maple Street, I declared, sitting up straight. She wants to make it a public issue? I'll make it a public institution. I'm going to open a community observatory. Silence. Then a slow, appreciative whistle from Dave. Oh, you magnificent bastard. You're serious. On my roof, I continued, the plan downloading into my brain fully formed. I'll build a proper little structure for it. A shed with a roll-off roof. I'll put up a sign. I'll print flyers. I'll invite the entire neighborhood, kids, families, everyone. I will drown her paranoid accusations in a tidal wave of wholesome, educational, community-building goodwill. You have to call it something that will just twist the knife, Dave said, now fully on board, his voice giddy with the promise of chaos. Something that will make her eye twitch every time she looks at it. The Carol Peterson Memorial Observatory. Too direct. Gives her power, I countered, already typing into my laptop's search bar. No, it needs to sound official. Benevolent, even. The North Maple Street Community Observatory. Ooh, that's good. That's passive-aggressively brilliant. She called my telescope creepy? I muttered, my fingers flying across the keyboard, pulling up city zoning codes and HOA bylaws. I'm going to make that telescope a local landmark. I'm going to get kids excited about science. I'm going to serve hot cocoa on meteor shower nights. I will become the Carl Sagan of this stupid beige cul-de-sac, and I will do it all right across the street from her, right under her perpetually disapproving nose. It was insane. It was disproportionate. It was going to cost a fortune and be a logistical nightmare. It was, without a doubt, the single greatest idea I had ever had. The vengeful fever dream of the previous night solidified into a cold, hard, logistical morning. If I was going to build a spite shed on my roof, I needed a professional. My DIY skills topped out at assembling IKEA furniture, and even then, there were usually a few mysterious leftover screws and a worrying wobble. Building a weatherproof structure capable of surviving a thunderstorm on a roof required someone who knew which end of a hammer to hold. My first two calls were spectacular failures. The first contractor, a chipper young man from a company called Rooftop Renovations, listened to my pitch with growing confusion before politely informing me that they mostly did sun decks and rooftop gardens, and that my project was a little outside their wheelhouse. He said it with the same tone one might use to turn down a request to build a functional catapult. The second guy just laughed for 30 straight seconds and hung up. My third and final call was to Gus's General Contracting. The name didn't inspire confidence. It sounded less like a business and more like a guy who might fix your porch and also sell you some suspiciously cheap tires out of his truck. A man with a voice that sounded like gravel in a coffee grinder answered with a single gruff word. Gus. I took a deep breath and launched into my now practiced spiel about a rooftop accessory structure and a personal astronomical observatory. I tried to sound as sane and official as possible. When I finished, there was a long, weary sigh on the other end of the line. You want to build a what now on your who now? An hour later, a beat-up Ford F-150 that looked like it had personally survived the Cretaceous period rumbled to a stop in front of my house. Gus emerged. He was a man in his 60s, built like a fire hydrant, with a thick mustache that seemed to have its own gravitational pull and hands that looked like they could crush bricks into dust. He wore a faded flannel shirt and a look on his face that suggested he'd already seen the stupidest thing humanity had to offer today, and was deeply disappointed to be proven wrong. He trudged up my driveway, cast a skeptical eye over my perfectly normal townhouse, and then squinted up at the roof. "You're the space shed kid?" he grunted. "Observatory," I corrected him. "And yes, that's me, Leo." I offered a hand. He ignored it and just gestured towards the house with his chin. "Let's see the roof." I led him through the house and up the attic ladder. He moved with a surprising agility for a man his size. On the roof, he walked the perimeter, stomping his work boots in a few places, peering at the seals around the vents. He circled Bertha, who I'd left set up as a visual aid, with the cautious curiosity of a bomb disposal expert. "Nice tube," he said, which I think was a compliment. "So, you want to build a little house for your space tube on top of your regular house?" "A roll-off roof observatory, to be precise," I said, unrolling a set of blueprints I'd downloaded from an amateur astronomy forum and modified myself. The structure itself is basically a reinforced shed, about 8 by 10 feet. But the roof is on a track system, so it can be pushed back to expose the telescope to the night sky. Gus stared at the plans, then at me, then at the plans again. His mustache twitched. "Kid, this is gonna cost you. You know that, right? Permits, materials, labor? We're talking custom work here." "I have a budget," I said, naming a figure that made my own stomach clench. Gus just grunted, a sound that could have meant anything from "that's reasonable" to "you're an idiot." He looked from my earnest, hopeful face to the perfectly pleasant house across the street, where I could just see a curtain twitch in the window. "All right, I'll bite," he said, finally looking me in the eye. "Why? This is a lot of trouble for a hobby. You got a wife kicking you out of the garage?" I hesitated. I could have made something up. I could have talked about my lifelong passion for science, my desire to protect my delicate equipment from the elements, but something about Gus's no-nonsense demeanor made me think he'd appreciate the truth in all its petty glory. "My neighbor," I said, pointing discreetly at Carol's house. "She came out the other night and screamed at me. Said my telescope was a creepy surveillance device and that I was a peeping Tom." Gus's expression didn't change, but a new light flickered in his eyes. A flicker of understanding, a flicker of respect. "She called you a weirdo?" "A creepy weirdo," I clarified, "and she threatened to call the cops and the HOA and have me shut down." "So you decided to double down," he stated, a slow grin spreading across his face, revealing a row of surprisingly white teeth. "Instead of putting the thing away, you're gonna build a permanent, city-permitted, professionally constructed monument to it, right where she has to look at it every single day." "That's the general idea," I admitted. "I'm branding it as a community observatory for the children. You know, STEM education." Gus let out a single, booming laugh that echoed across the rooftops. It was the sound of a man who appreciated craftsmanship, whether it was a well-built retaining wall or a perfectly executed act of suburban revenge. "A spite shed," he chuckled, shaking his head. "A goddamn spite shed. Kid, I've been in this business for 40 years. I've built wine cellars for guys who only drink beer and panic rooms for people who live in the safest town in America. I once built a soundproofed room for a guy's pet parrot because the neighbor complained about the squawking. But a spite observatory, that's a new one. I like it." He slapped me on the back, a gesture that nearly sent me tumbling off the roof. "All right, Leo, you got yourself a contractor, but you handle the HOA. I build things. I don't deal with committees of bored housewives." "That's the deal," I said, a wave of relief washing over me. "Good," he said, pulling out a tape measure. "Now let's figure out how to build your war machine." As we stood there, planning the dimensions and discussing load-bearing walls, I felt a profound sense of purpose. This was no longer just a ridiculous idea born of anger. It was a project. It had blueprints. It had a contractor named Gus. And across the street, behind her twitching curtain, my nemesis had no idea what she had just unleashed. The first sign of war was the arrival of Gus's truck at 7 o'clock sharp on a Monday morning, followed by a flatbed carrying a mountain of lumber, roofing materials, and metal tracks. The sound of a circular saw biting into wood was my new alarm clock. and it was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. For Carol Peterson, I imagine it sounded like the drums of an invading army. Construction began immediately and with impressive efficiency. Gus and his two-man crew, a pair of wiry young guys who communicated almost exclusively through grunts and head nods, worked with the focused intensity of a special ops team. Within 2 days, the frame of the observatory was up. It looked like a bizarre wooden cube that had been dropped onto my roof by a clumsy giant. And Carol, true to form, was documenting every moment. Her vigil was unnerving. Every time I looked out my window, she was there. Sometimes on her porch, phone held aloft in landscape mode like she was filming a school play. Sometimes peeking through her blinds, the glint of her screen the only sign of her presence. She was building her case, compiling her dossier of my supposed crimes against suburbia. I made a point of giving her a cheerful wave every time I saw her. It never failed to make her flinch back behind the curtain. The inevitable call came on Wednesday afternoon. I was in my home office trying to concentrate on a quarterly report, but the rhythmic thud of a nail gun from above was making it difficult. I saw the black and white cruiser pull up to the curb, its lights off, moving with a kind of reluctant slowness. The end game had begun. I met them at the door before they even had a chance to knock. 2 officers unfolded themselves from the car. One was older, with a weary, deeply unimpressed look on his face and a name tag that read Miller. The other was younger, taller, with a fresh-faced, by-the-book eagerness. His tag read Jenkins. Classic good cop, bored cop. "Good afternoon, officers," I said with a calm, welcoming smile that I'd been practicing in the mirror. "Leo Maxwell, can I help you with something?" Miller's eyes flickered up towards my roof, where the hammering had momentarily stopped. "Sir, we received a call about a disturbance. Something about unauthorized major construction?" He said it with the air of a man who was quoting from a very silly book. "Ah, yes, that would be my observatory," I said, my smile not wavering. "Please, come in. I can explain everything. Can I get you some coffee? It's terrible, but it's hot." They exchanged a look. Jenkins seemed intrigued. Miller just seemed tired. They followed me inside. Gus and his crew, bless their hearts, had chosen that exact moment to take a break, and they were now peering down from the roofline like curious gargoyles. I had prepared for this moment. On my dining room table, laid out in neat, orderly stacks, was a portfolio of documents. I had the building permit from the city, stamped and approved. I had a copy of the HOA bylaws with the relevant section on rooftop accessory structures under 120 square feet, highlighted in yellow. I had my blueprints. I had a printed-out artist's rendering of the finished observatory, looking noble and scientific against a starry sky. It was a presentation of overwhelming bureaucratic competence. "As you can see, officers," I began, gesturing to the paperwork like a game show host revealing the grand prize, "everything is fully permitted and in compliance with all local ordinances and HOA covenants. The structure is an amateur astronomical observatory for observing celestial objects. You know, planets, nebulae, that sort of thing." Jenkins picked up the permit, examining it with genuine interest. "An observatory, huh? Cool." Miller, however, wasn't looking at the paperwork. He was looking at me. "Son, your neighbor, a Miss Carol Peterson, seems to be under a different impression. Her report mentioned an illegal sniper's nest." I had to physically restrain myself from laughing. I kept my expression serious, concerned. "A sniper's nest? Wow, that's a very creative interpretation. I can assure you the only thing I'll be shooting up there is astrophotography. It's all about perspective, officer. Where she sees a military installation, I see a learning hub, a place to engage with science." "A learning hub," Miller repeated, his face a perfect, unreadable mask of professional neutrality. And what prompted the sudden construction of this hub? This was the moment of truth. I decided to bet on honesty. "My neighbor," I said, meeting his gaze. "Miss Peterson confronted me last week while I was using my telescope on the roof. She accused me of spying on her and her family, called my hobby creepy, threatened to report me. I figured that if my private hobby was going to be treated like a public nuisance, the best solution was to turn it into a public good. Make it an official, open, community-oriented project that she couldn't possibly object to without looking completely unreasonable. A strange thing happened. The corner of Officer Miller's mouth twitched. It was the barest hint of a smile, gone as quickly as it appeared. Officer Jenkins, less skilled in the art of emotional suppression, coughed loudly into his fist, his shoulders shaking. "I see," Miller said, his voice perfectly level. He turned to his partner. "Jenkins, why don't you go have a chat with Miss Peterson, get her side of the story?" "Yes, sir," Jenkins said, practically bolting for the door, clearly desperate to not burst into laughter in my dining room. Through my front window, I watched the tragicomedy unfold on Carol's lawn. Jenkins stood patiently on the sidewalk while Carol, who had emerged from her house like she'd been spring-loaded, engaged in what appeared to be a masterclass in hysterical gesticulation. She pointed at my roof. She pointed at her own windows. She stabbed a finger in Jenkins's chest. Jenkins just nodded, occasionally looking down at his notepad. The conversation lasted for nearly 10 minutes. When he finally extricated himself and walked back across the street, he looked like a man who had just survived a natural disaster. He muttered something to Miller, who simply nodded. "All right, Mr. Maxwell," Miller said, turning back to me. "Your paperwork is in order. You're not violating any laws. As far as the city is concerned, you're free to build your learning hub." He paused, then added, "But as a friendly piece of advice, try to keep the community outreach quiet, for your own sake." "I'll do my best, officer," I said gravely. "Thank you for your time." They left. As the cruiser pulled away, Gus came clomping down the attic ladder. "Cops gone?" he asked. "Cops gone," I confirmed. "She really called this a sniper's nest?" "She did." Gus shook his head, a grin on his face. "Lady's got an imagination, I'll give her that. All right, boys, break's over. Let's finish this war machine." 2 days later, the observatory was complete. It was a thing of beauty. A compact, sturdy little house for Bertha, with perfectly stained wood siding and a roof that rolled back on its tracks with a smooth, satisfying rumble. It was everything I had dreamed of, but it needed one final touch. The next morning, before the sun was fully up, I climbed onto the roof with a large, rolled-up cylinder. I unfurled it and, with the help of some carefully placed hooks, attached a massive vinyl banner to the side of the observatory facing Carol's house. It had been professionally printed in a friendly, welcoming font, a deep celestial blue with white lettering. It read, "The North Maple Street Community Observatory. Everyone welcome, especially nosy neighbors." I stood back to admire my handiwork. It was petty, it was provocative, it was perfect. The war of words was over. Now, the war for the hearts and minds of the neighborhood would begin. With the banner acting as my declaration of intent, the next phase of the operation required boots on the ground. A community observatory isn't a community observatory without, well, a community. And a community, I was quickly learning, doesn't just materialize out of thin air. It has to be courted. It has to be bribed with the promise of free educational entertainment. So I spent an afternoon playing the part of the friendly neighborhood science guy. I had printed 100 simple, elegant flyers on nice cardstock. They featured a tasteful picture of Saturn, the name of the observatory, and an invitation to the grand opening night that Saturday. Discover the wonders of the cosmos from your own backyard. See the rings of Saturn, the moons of Jupiter, and more. Free hot cocoa and cookies will be provided. I figured free sugar was a solid strategy for winning over both children and adults. My journey through the beige labyrinth of North Maple Street was an education in suburban archetypes. First, there was Mr. Henderson from 2 doors down, a grumpy septuagenarian who was perpetually at war with a squirrel in his bird feeder. He opened his door a crack, snatched the flyer from my hand, read the first line, and grunted, "Stars? Can't see 'em anyway with all these damn streetlights. Waste of time." The door closed. A promising start. Next was the young couple in number 42. A pair of exhausted-looking millennials who I think were named Chad and Jennifer. They took the flyer with the kind of dazed politeness of people who haven't slept in 3 years. "Oh, that's neat," Chad said, his eyes already glazing over. "We'll, try to make it, if the baby's not, you know." He made a vague gesture that seemed to encompass colic, tantrums, and projectile vomiting. I told them I understood completely. My hopes were beginning to dwindle. Maybe Carol was right. Maybe I was just the neighborhood weirdo, and this grand gesture was destined to be a sad, lonely party for one on a roof. And then I knocked on the door of number 35. It was answered by a man about my age with kind eyes and a t-shirt that said, "There's no place like 127.0.0.1. A fellow nerd. His name was Ben Washington. Behind him, 2 small children, a boy and a girl, peered around his legs. "Hi," I said, launching into my spiel. "I'm Leo from number 28. I'm opening a small observatory on my roof and wanted to invite you and your family to the grand opening this Saturday." I handed him the flyer. He read it, and his eyes lit up with genuine excitement. "No way! A real observatory? Here?" He turned to his kids. "Chloe, Sam, look at this! Mr. Maxwell is going to show us Saturn!" The little girl, Chloe, who couldn't have been more than 8, let out a legitimate squeal of delight. "The real Saturn? With the rings?" "The very same," I said, my spirit lifting. "We are so there," Ben said, his wife, Sarah, now appearing at his shoulder and smiling warmly. "The kids are obsessed with space right now. This is amazing. Thank you for doing this." I walked away from their house feeling about 10 feet tall. I had found my target audience. My victory over Carol would be built on the scientific curiosity of an 8-year-old girl. By the time Saturday night rolled around, I was a bundle of nerves. I had a crock pot of hot cocoa warming in the kitchen, a platter of store-bought chocolate chip cookies arranged artfully, and Bertha polished to a shine. What if no one came? What if only the Hendersons came and complained about the cookies? At 8 p.m. sharp, my doorbell rang. It was the Washingtons, all 4 of them bundled in jackets, their faces beaming with anticipation. A few minutes later, the millennial couple, Chad and Jennifer, showed up, looking shell-shocked. "The baby fell asleep," Jennifer whispered, as if a loud noise might wake him from 3 houses away. "We have a 45-minute window of freedom. Show us a planet." Finally, just as I was about to lead the small group upstairs, my doorbell rang one last time. It was Mrs. Gable, a sweet, white-haired widow from the end of the block. She held my flyer in one hand and a plate of homemade brownies in the other. "I thought your cookies might need some company, dear," she said with a wink. "I haven't looked through a telescope since I was a girl. I wouldn't miss this for the world." My heart swelled. This was a party. A small, slightly eclectic party, but a party nonetheless. I led my little flock up to the roof. The observatory was magnificent. I had strung up a few subtle red rope lights for safety, which cast a warm, professional glow without ruining our night vision. The roof of the structure was rolled back, and Bertha stood proudly, already aimed at her first target. Across the street, I could see her. Carol. A shadow in her upstairs window, the telltale bluish light of a phone screen illuminating her face. She was watching. Documenting. "Good. Let her watch." For the next hour, I forgot all about Carol. I forgot about spite and revenge and HOAs. I was just a guy sharing something I loved. I lifted Chloe Washington up so she could see through the eyepiece. The gasp she let out when she saw Saturn's rings for the first time was so pure, so full of unadulterated wonder, it was like a shot of adrenaline. Her brother, Sam, thought Jupiter looked like a big jawbreaker. Chad and Jennifer stared at the moon's craters, their exhausted faces softening with a shared moment of awe. Mrs. Gable looked at the Pleiades star cluster and told us a story about seeing it with her late husband on their honeymoon. We drank hot cocoa and ate Mrs. Gable's far superior brownies. We talked and laughed. For a little while, under the vast, star-dusted canopy of the night sky, we weren't just a random collection of people living in beige boxes. We were a community. I looked over at Carol's house. The light in the window was still there. She was gathering her evidence, preparing for her next attack. I was sure of it. But as I watched Chloe excitedly explaining the Galilean moons to her parents, I realized my strategy had fundamentally changed. I had started this project to prove a point to one person. But now, it wasn't about her anymore. It was about them. It was about this. This was better than revenge. This was victory. The pleasant afterglow of the grand opening lasted for approximately 3 days. I had hosted another, smaller viewing session for the Washingtons and a few of their friends. The Observatory was becoming a low-key neighborhood hit. I was starting to think that perhaps Carol had accepted defeat, retreating to her beige fortress to lick her wounds and laminate new passive-aggressive notes. I had, as usual, underestimated the furious, inexhaustible engine of suburban grievance. The email arrived on a Wednesday morning. The subject line, in ominous all caps, read, "Emergency HOA meeting. Agenda Item 1. Unpermitted rooftop structure and nuisance complaint. Re 28 North Maple Street." So this was her next move. She had failed to win over the cops, so she was falling back to her home turf, the bureaucratic quagmire of the North Maple Street Homeowners Association. It was a bold gambit. The HOA, presided over by a retired insurance adjuster named Stan, was known for its draconian enforcement of rules regarding trash can visibility and acceptable shades of taupe for exterior paint. This was a battle I could easily lose. The meeting was held in the windowless basement of the community clubhouse, a sad, beige room that smelled faintly of stale coffee and shattered dreams. The air was thick with tension. About 20 residents were there, sitting on uncomfortable folding chairs. At the front of the room, the 3-person HOA board. Stan, a stern-looking woman named Brenda, and a perpetually confused man named Gary, sat at a folding table, looking grim. Carol was in the front row, clutching a thick binder to her chest, her dossier. She gave me a triumphant little smirk as I walked in. I gave her a polite nod and took a seat in the back. Stan banged a small gavel. "This emergency meeting of the North Maple Street HOA is now in session. We are here to discuss a formal complaint filed by Miss Carol Peterson regarding the property at 28 North Maple Street, owned by Mr. Leo Maxwell." He gestured to Carol, who rose with the dramatic gravity of a prosecutor beginning a closing argument. "Thank you, Stan," she began, her voice quivering with manufactured outrage. "Friends, neighbors, for weeks our peaceful community has been under assault." She opened her binder and began her presentation. It was a masterwork of paranoid delusion. She had blurry, zoomed-in photos of Gus's construction crew, which she presented as unknown, unvetted laborers. She had a minute-by-minute log of every time I had been on my roof. She had photos of the grand opening, which she framed as an unlicensed, late-night commercial enterprise. "This structure," she said, her voice dripping with contempt, "is an eyesore that is undoubtedly lowering our property values. The constant gatherings on the roof are a source of noise and light pollution, but most importantly, She leaned forward, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "It is a safety and privacy concern. This observatory has a powerful telescope with a direct line of sight into at least 6 homes on this street. We do not know what Mr. Maxwell is really looking at." A murmur went through the room. A few people shot nervous glances my way. Her fear-mongering was working. She had planted the seed of doubt. She concluded her speech with a flourish, demanding the HOA board issue a formal citation and order me to dismantle the illegal structure immediately. She sat down, looking immensely pleased with herself. Stan adjusted his glasses and peered down at me. "Mr. Maxwell, do you have a response?" "I do, Stan," I said, standing up and walking to the front of the room. I was holding my laptop. I hadn't come unprepared. "Brenda, would you mind dimming the lights?" I asked. I connected my laptop to the ancient projector sitting on a cart. An image flashed onto the pull-down screen. The Hubble Deep Field. A breathtaking tapestry of thousands of distant galaxies. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice calm and friendly. "My name is Leo Maxwell, and I am your friendly neighborhood astronomer. Miss Peterson has raised some concerns tonight, and I want to address them directly. But first, I want to show you what we're really looking at from my roof." I clicked to the next slide. It was a stunning photo of the Orion Nebula I had taken myself. This is what Bertha sees. Not your living rooms, not your backyards. This, a stellar nursery 1,500 light-years away, where new stars are being born. My presentation was titled, "Reaching for the Stars, an Asset to Our Community." I went through Carol's points, one by one, calmly and methodically dismantling them with facts. Concern. Property values. Click. The next slide showed a Zillow article titled, "Unique Home Features That Can Boost Your Property Value." I'd photoshopped Rooftop Observatory onto the list. A few people chuckled. A unique, educational feature like this makes our neighborhood more desirable, not less. Concern. Noise and nuisance. Click. A slide with a proposed schedule. To ensure peace and quiet for all residents, I propose official observatory hours, Fridays and Saturdays only, from 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. sharp. All other viewings by appointment only. Concern, privacy. Click. A diagram showing the focal length of my telescope, with a comical drawing of an upside-down, blurry stick figure to represent terrestrial viewing. As I have explained before, my telescope is physically incapable of being used for spying. It's a scientific instrument, not a surveillance camera. My final slide was the ace up my sleeve. It was a collage of photos from the grand opening night. There was Chloe Washington, her eye pressed to the eyepiece, her face alight with wonder. There was Mrs. Gable, smiling and holding her plate of brownies. There was even the millennial couple, Chad and Jennifer, holding hands and looking at the moon, a rare moment of peace for them, I imagined. "This is what the North Maple Street Community Observatory is all about," I said, my voice filled with a sincerity that surprised even me. It's about community. It's about education. It's about sharing a sense of wonder with our neighbors. In a world that often feels divided, it's a chance for us to come together and look up at something bigger than all of us. I don't believe that's a nuisance. I believe it's an asset. I finished. The room was silent for a moment. Then Sarah Washington, Chloe's mom, stood up. "I just want to say," she said, her voice clear and strong, "that my kids loved it. It was the most exciting thing that's happened on this street in years. It's a wonderful thing for our children." Mrs. Gable stood up next. "I agree. It's lovely. And Leo is a very responsible young man." The tide had turned. Carol sat in her chair, her face ashen, her binder of evidence looking flimsy and foolish. Stan cleared his throat and called for a vote from the board. All in favor of issuing a citation to Mr. Maxwell? Stan, Brenda, and Gary all looked at each other. Not a single hand went up. All opposed? 3 hands went up immediately. Stan banged his gavel. The motion is denied. Meeting adjourned. It was a total, crushing victory. As people filed out, many of them stopped to pat me on the back or say they'd be by on Friday night. I packed up my laptop, a wide grin plastered on my face. As I passed Carol, she hissed at me, her voice a low, venomous whisper. This isn't over, you'll see. I just smiled. Clear skies, Carol. Defeat at the hands of the HOA did not chasten Carol. It radicalized her. Her surveillance became more overt, her glares more intense. She had lost the legal and political battles, so she retreated into a cold war of passive aggression. But I knew a final, desperate offensive was coming. I just didn't know when or how. The perfect opportunity presented itself 2 weeks later. The peak of the annual Perseid meteor shower. It's one of the best celestial shows of the year, with dozens of shooting stars visible per hour. It was the ideal event for a community viewing party. This time I went all out. I created a Facebook event page. I put up a new, larger sign in my front yard. I bought extra camp chairs and blankets. The response was overwhelming. Nearly 30 people RSVP'd, from the Washingtons and Mrs. Gable to families I had never even met from the next street over. The observatory had become a local phenomenon. The night of the shower was perfect. The sky was clear and moonless, a black velvet canvas waiting to be painted with streaks of cosmic dust. By 9 p.m., my roof was transformed into a bustling, festive stargazer's lounge. Kids were zipped into sleeping bags, sipping hot chocolate. Adults were laid out on blankets, their faces turned to the heavens. I had Bertha pointed at the Andromeda galaxy for anyone who wanted a look. But the main event required no equipment at all, just patience and a willingness to be awed. A low, happy murmur of conversation filled the air. It was the embodiment of everything I had claimed the observatory would be, a hub of community and wonder. Across the street, Carol's house was dark and silent. Ominously so, it felt like the quiet before a storm. Around 9:30 p.m., the first few meteors started to appear. A collective "ooh" went through the crowd as a bright green fireball blazed a trail across the sky. The show was beginning. The kids were squealing with delight. It was magical. And then it happened. With the sudden, jarring hum of an industrial generator, Carol's house lit up like a maximum security prison. 2 massive, blindingly bright floodlights, mounted on tripods on her second-story balcony, roared to life. They weren't aimed at her yard. They were aimed directly at my roof. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Our carefully preserved night vision was obliterated. The velvet black sky was washed out into a murky, polluted gray. The faint stars vanished. The magic was shattered, replaced by a harsh, sterile glare. A collective groan of disappointment and anger swept through my guests. "What is she doing?" Sarah Washington asked, shielding her eyes. "She's ruining it," Chloe said, her voice small and heartbroken. I stood there, stunned by the sheer, unadulterated malice of it. This was no longer about rules or privacy. This was a direct, calculated act of sabotage. This was scorched earth warfare. She couldn't win, so she had decided to ruin the game for everyone. For a moment, I felt a surge of despair. She had won. But then, something incredible happened. Ben Washington, the quiet software engineer, stood up. He didn't say a word. He walked to the edge of the roof, facing Carol's house, took off his dark fleece jacket, and held it up over his head, creating a small patch of shadow. It was a futile gesture, but it was a gesture nonetheless. A moment later, Chad, the tired millennial dad, stood up beside him, holding up a picnic blanket he and Jennifer had been using. The two of them, standing side by side, created a larger shield of darkness. Then, Mrs. Gable's son, who had brought her to the party, stood up with another blanket. One by one, my guests, my community, formed a human wall along the edge of the roof, holding up jackets, blankets, even flattened cardboard boxes, creating a makeshift barrier against the assault of light. They were fighting back, for the stars, for the kids, for the simple right to enjoy a beautiful night. My despair vanished, replaced by a fierce, soaring pride. My silly little spite shed had become a fortress, and these people were its defenders. Someone, I never found out who, must have called the police, because 10 minutes later I saw the familiar black and white cruiser rolling down the street. This time there was no reluctance. Officers Miller and Jenkins got out of the car and just stood there for a long moment, taking in the utterly bizarre scene. A rooftop full of people holding blankets like medieval soldiers with shields, and a neighboring house waging a war of illumination against them. Miller didn't even look at me. He pinched the bridge of his nose, let out a sigh that I could feel from 50 feet away, and then marched directly up Carol Peterson's driveway with a look of grim determination on his face. Jenkins followed, looking both exasperated and, I think, a little bit thrilled by the sheer insanity of it all. We all watched, a silent, blanket-wielding audience, as Miller banged on Carol's door. She opened it, a triumphant scowl on her face, which quickly dissolved into confusion as Miller began to speak, his voice inaudible, but his gestures sharp and angry. He pointed at the floodlights. He pointed at my roof. He pulled out his ticket book. Carol's face went through a rapid series of emotions: defiance, indignation, disbelief, and finally sputtering, humiliated defeat. Jenkins walked over to the side of her house and unplugged the floodlights. And just like that, the world went dark again. A cheer erupted from the roof, a loud, joyous, defiant roar that echoed through the quiet suburban night. And at that exact moment, as if on cue from a cosmic director, a massive, brilliant Perseid meteor tore across the sky, a long, fiery exclamation point on our victory. The great meteor shower war was over. We had won. The aftermath of the floodlight incident was swift and decisive. A public nuisance citation, witnessed by 30 of her neighbors, was a humiliation from which Carol's reign of terror could not recover. She became a ghost on North Maple Street. The judgmental stares from the porch ceased. The curtains stopped twitching. Her power, which had always been derived from intimidation and the assumption that no one would dare challenge her, had evaporated in a single, spectacular backfire. She had waged a war against a man with a telescope, and had somehow lost to a coalition of parents, senior citizens, and picnic blankets. In the weeks and months that followed, the North Maple Street Community Observatory became exactly what I had sarcastically pitched to the HOA, a beloved community asset. Friday nights on my roof became a neighborhood tradition. I got to know people I had only ever seen pulling in their recycling bins. I learned that Mr. Henderson, the grumpy old man, was a retired Air Force pilot who had fascinating stories about navigating by the stars. He even cracked a smile when I showed him the Andromeda Galaxy. I learned that Jennifer was a graphic designer, and she designed a cool official logo for the observatory, which I had made into patches for the kids. The observatory, born from anger and spite, had accidentally become one of the best parts of my life. It had forced me out of my solitary shell and connected me to the people around me in a way I never expected. My petty quest for revenge had inadvertently built a community. Tonight, a few months after the great meteor shower war, the air is cool and the sky is brilliant. The roof is quiet. It's just me, Ben, and his family, And Mrs. Gable. Chloe is at the eyepiece of Bertha, sketching the craters of the moon in a little notebook she now carries everywhere. Sam is asking me if black holes can swallow ghosts. Mrs. Gable is pointing out constellations to Ben, telling him the stories her father used to tell her. I lean back in my chair, sipping a cup of hot chocolate, and just listen to the quiet, happy sounds. The murmur of conversation, the scratch of Chloe's pencil, the distant hum of the city. I look over at Carol's house. It's dark, save for the faint, blue glow of a television in the living room. It's just another house now, stripped of all its menace. She called my telescope creepy. And in a way, I guess I should thank her. She wanted me to hide my passion away, to be ashamed of it. Instead, she made me build a monument to it. Now, every clear night, my roof is full of people looking up, their faces filled with a simple, profound wonder. All because one person was so determined to look down on me. I get up and take a look through the finder scope, scanning the glittering star field. Turns out the best way to deal with a black hole of negativity isn't to fight it. It's to surround it with a whole new constellation of good people shining so brightly they simply wash it out.